today, not a great milestone for Victoria, their highest number of cases, but the Chief Health Officer there, hopeful, and he said as much, that today is the peak and that their modelling suggests it might be.
Yes, well, that's a prediction that might not age well if it turns out that, we get higher numbers tomorrow and the days after it. It's very hard to know, of course. It's a very difficult situation. No one would wish that. This is such a setback for Victoria and for the nation. These numbers have not been going up exponentially. We've been into these, several hundred type numbers for a while, but going above 500. That's psychologically very depressing, I guess, for everyone, and particularly those experiencing this second lockdown. But it is interesting that we hear that the modelling suggests this may be the peak. That would be fantastic if that is the case, because we're now, two weeks and a bit into this lockdown, so we're past a full replication cycle of the virus as we understand it, and we've just got to hope that their modelling is correct.
They're under a lot of pressure, obviously, with the tracing and all that sort of thing, but Andrew Clennell reported earlier that 9 days for some of the tracing, whereas in New South Wales, including in regional areas, it's only 24 hours from the time that in terms of the test response. If you get a test, you will get the result back within 24 hours in New South Wales. In regional Victoria, they're saying it can be up to 9 days.
Well, that is just completely unacceptable. I mean, you remember at the start of this, that when testing was in its infancy, that there was a bit of a high bar for testing. You had to have symptoms, you had to have a reason why you needed to be tested, you had to think that you had legitimate, had contact with someone who had it or whatever. That was because they were trying to manage the load. It's since changed. Everyone is encouraged with even the slightest symptoms to get a test. And of course, associated with that test comes the obligation to not have any contact with anyone while you're waiting for the results. It's unacceptable for that to be such a long period, only to find that it could be a negative result, particularly if people are having it out of an abundance of caution. They're not feeling any symptoms. They've known someone who thought they did, whatever it might be. They have a test and then they're required to wait for an inordinate period of time. And of course, that makes contact tracing, if it turns out that they test positive during that period, particularly if they haven't been isolating for a whole week or whatever it might be, that makes that impossible. So well, not impossible, but extremely difficult. So that's dysfunction at a very fundamental level, if that's the case.
And huge frustration for those communities concerned who are waiting day after day. But let's look at the economic situation, because the last week the Treasurer seemed to, have quite an effective week, a very tough one in terms of having to manage the JobKeeper, JobSeeker continuation plus the budget statement. Then on Friday made this interesting reference to two Conservative leaders from the 1980s. It's been quite a distraction. What have you made of it?
This is Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. I mean, these are two of the sort of lodestars of conservatism, but they are also some of the most polarising figures of post-war politics, really. They are incredibly despised on the left. They may be popular in the coalition party room, and I suspect that's what this is about. I mean, if you look at the journey the coalition's been through, it gets elected on not really much of an agenda other than, tax cuts and not being Labor. It doesn't really have all that much to do. It's trying to work out where it stands, and suddenly it is mugged by this, like we all have been, by this COVID crisis. Suddenly it has this enormous task to do. And what does it do? It does what it has to do. No, I'm not criticising it here. It does what it absolutely has to do. And they've turned themselves into hyper-Keynesians. They are borrowing money and spending it at a rate none of us have ever seen before.
And cooperating with the unions and others.
Yeah,
it's
precisely
not really the symbol of division at all. The Prime Minister's been seeking to bring everyone together.
That's right. And so I think they need a narrative to explain it to their hardliners within the, to the base. I mean, basically to sort of say, look, this is what we stand for. Now, I think Josh reached into the closet and pulled out these two coats, as it were, of Thatcher and Reagan, and said, this is the model that we're following. But of course, it doesn't stand up to a great deal of scrutiny because they were divisive figures. They had wars with the unions. I mean, Thatcher and the miners, for example, was colossally divisive, and the dislocation that occurred in Northern England in particular, you could probably draw a line with all of that dislocation and everything that's happened since, right up through to its support in the north of England for Brexit, because of that economic disadvantage. So that's not a model this government wants to follow, and particularly when it's at this very moment, as you say, making an overture toward the unions for a whole new era of cooperation.
The Prime Minister didn't follow it. He was asked about it. He said, we are adopting an uniquely Australian recovery and response.
Yeah, well,
so he didn't go near it, didn't even mention their names.
I think that was the right rein to pull on. I'm not trying to attack Josh Frydenberg here. I think in policy terms, they're on the same page, but in terms of the explanation, I think invoking Thatcher and Reagan the Prime Minister's instincts are right on that. It's just not where they want to go.